The responsibility of a pole vault official is to conduct a safe and fair competition. That starts with the proper setup of the pole vault pit and venue. This video will cover the parallelogram method of aligning pole vault standards when setting up a pit for a pole vault competition. By using the parallelogram method, you will ensure that the standards will track not only parallel to each other, but parallel to the runway. This will maintain consistent overlap of the crossbar on the support pegs during a competition. The first case shows standards that are properly aligned to each other and to the runway. Note, two sets of standards are shown to indicate the standards at 0 and 80 over the full range of their travel. The peg separation remains the same, 4.31 meters, when the standards are moved from 0 to 80, so they are aligned to each other. The standards also track parallel to the runway lines indicated by the dashed lines. The lowest part of the crossbar will always be in the center. This is the fairest setup. The parallelogram method will result in a setup like this. In the next example, the standards are not parallel to the runway because the distance from the dashed lines changes as the standards move from 0 to 80. The standards are parallel to each other. Aligning standards by simply moving them from 0 to 80 and observing the crossbar overlap of the pegs could result in a setup like this. In the last example, the standards do not track parallel with the runway or parallel with each other. The parallelogram method would enable you to determine which standard needs to be adjusted, the right in this case. With other methods of standards alignment, you would have to guess which standard to move. Venue setup has 4 parts. Standards alignment is the subject of this video. Parts 1, 2, and 4 will be covered in separate videos. Before getting into the setup procedure, we must define some terms to make sure that we are all on the same page. The zero line is defined as the inside edge of the top of the back of the box and is the reference from which all measurements are made. The standards must be properly aligned to the zero line to enable accurate measurement of the height of the crossbar and depth of the standards. Because the landing pads will cover the ground between the box and the standards, a zero line should be painted on the track surface to assist with aligning the standards. The zero line should be 1 centimeter wide and at least 7 meters long to extend beyond the landing pads. This method is called the parallelogram method, so we must define what a parallelogram is. A parallelogram is a 4-sided figure in which opposite sides are equal in length and parallel to each other. These properties are the key to the parallelogram method. I will now highlight important points of the parallelogram method before going through a setup. 2 tacks will be placed 80 centimeters apart in the center of the runway, forming reference line AB. The 12-foot takeoff mark is convenient to use for the first tack. This also keeps the second tack from getting too close to the pit. Take care to ensure that the tacks are in the center of the runway. Standards travel is 80 centimeters. This forms the second side of the parallelogram. The standards base CD will be adjusted parallel to the reference line by moving the back end of the base while keeping the front part of the base in place. The goal is to make the distance from point A on the runway to the standard at 0, length AC in the drawing, equal to the distance from point B on the runway to the standard at 80, length BD in the drawing. Note that because pads are in the way, measurements cannot be just along the ground. Some measurements will be made from the ground to a point on the standard. In this case, point C is 1.7 meters high on the standard to prevent the tape measure from dragging on the pads. Mark this point on the standard because it will be used again in the next measurement. The next measurement is from point B to point D on the standard. This forms a parallelogram from the ground to the standard, which is shown in the yellow in this diagram. Mark the base of each standard with a scale from 0 to 80 centimeters. Be sure to mark the side of the standard that will be closest to the pit. That will be visible to the operator who is on the standard and adjusting the standard depth. An important tip would be to set 80 centimeters equal to the standard all the way back. This will simplify things for your pit crew because then they will have to just push the standard all the way back to reach 80. Now we will go over the parallelogram method in more detail. Step 1, mark the center of the back of the box. The back of the box is 40.8 centimeters wide, so place a mark at 20.4 centimeters. This will be your reference point for spacing the standards and for all measurements relative to the zero line. Step 2, remove the standard covers and slide the uprights forward to 0. Step 3. Center the standards equidistant from the middle of the box. Use the mark placed in Step 1 as your reference for the center point. Align 0 on the base with the front edge of the zero line. Use a roofing square to help align the base perpendicular to the zero line. The separation distance will vary depending on the brand of standards you are using. A pole vault crossbar is 4.5 meters long. To facilitate the use of a landing area 6 meters wide, the pegs supporting the crossbar may be placed upon extension arms attached to the uprights, thus allowing the uprights to be placed wider apart without increasing the length of the crossbar. Note that the peg offset distance is measured from the inside edge of the upright to the center of the peg. By rule, the support pegs are to be spaced 4.28 to 4.37 meters apart. On most pole vault standards, the pegs are too high to measure the spacing directly. However, you can measure the spacing between the uprights, from inside edge to inside edge. This table shows the proper upright spacing for the two largest U.S. brands of pole vault standards. Note that the differences in upright spacing are due to the difference in the peg offset, which varies by vendor. Step 4 is a critical step. This is where you will form a reference line that is parallel to the runway. Place two tacks 80 centimeters apart in the center of the runway. Place the first tack at the back of the 12-foot takeoff line, which is 3.70 meters from the back of the box. This will be point A. The second tack will be placed 80 centimeters closer to the box at 2.90 meters from the back of the box. This will be point B. If the second tack is closer than 2.75 meters or 9 feet, you will have a very steep angle to the standard to avoid dragging the tape measure on the pit. This also means you will have to hold much higher on the standard in making a measurement. Step 5. Measure length AC from point A in the runway to point C on the standard at 0. As before, point C is 1.70 meters above ground. Mark this point on the standard because it will be used again in the next measurement. Step 6. Move the standard to 80 and move to point B. Measure the length BD from point B in the runway to point D on the standard at 80. You will now move the base of the standards in order to make length BD, the distance from point B to the standard at 80, equal to the length AC, the distance from point A to the standard at 0. Ideally, these lengths would be equal, but in most meets, a difference of 1 to 2 centimeters is acceptable. In a championship meet, however, you would want these lengths to be identical. If length BD that is from point B on the runway to the standard at 80, is less than length AC, the distance from point A on the runway to the standard at 0, pull the back end of the standard away from the pit. This will make BD longer and AC shorter. If length BD is longer than AC, push the back end of the standard toward the pit. This will make BD shorter and AC longer. You've now finished with the left standard. Step 7, move to the right standard and measure the length from point A in the runway to point E on the standard at 0. Once again, point E is 1.7 meters above ground. Mark the point on this standard as you did for the left standard because it will be used in the next measurement. Step 8, move the standard to 80 and move to point B. Measure the length from point B to point F on the standard, length BF. Remember, these measurements are made high on the standard so that the tape measure will not drag on the pit. If length BF is less than length AE, pull the back end of the standard away from the pit. That will make BF longer and AE shorter. If BF is more than AE, push the back end of the standard toward the pit. Now that the bases have been aligned, we will do a plumb bob check to verify that the front edge of the crossbar aligns with the 0 line. Move the standards to 0, put a crossbar on the top pegs, throw the plumb bob over the bar toward the runway so that it hangs over the front edge of the crossbar. Note where the plumb bob points. It should be pointing to the 0 line, which is the front edge of the top of the back of the box. If it is not pointing at that point, slide the standards forward or back until the plumb bob does align to the 0 line. If you have to shift the standards, you may have to shift the zeros on your scale on the bases. Here's a summary of the steps that have been taken for the parallelogram method. Very important, after you finish your setup with the parallelogram method, remember to remove the tacks from the runway before starting competition. So with the parallelogram method, we've shown that both standards align to reference line AB. Since AB is in the center of the runway, AB is parallel to the runway lines. Therefore, the standards are parallel to the runway and the standards are parallel to each other.